Welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21. And as most of you know, I'm sure, we do regular webinars like this on most Tuesday evenings. And the idea behind these webinars is to try and involve a wide audience, indeed a global audience, on discussing some of the big issues of the 21st century, the issues that affect us every day and the way our world is changing in what is very turbulent times. And in this webinar, we're going to look at future of democracy itself. Now, we all know in the Western world, in our Western democracies, democracy itself is being challenged. There's a lot of disengagement, there's a lot of disillusionment with it, and there's a lot of disconnection between those who make decisions and citizens at grassroots level. And there are a lot of people trying to think now, how can we reconnect? How can we reinvent? And how can we re-engage? If we're going to make sure that our democracy survives, we have to have that reconnection. So that's what this webinar is about. And we've got three people here, and I'll go to the gallery view, who you can see. We've got Andy Paice, Corinna Lotz, and Paul Feldman. You see Fong as well. Fong comes on and she will be helping us with the questions and the comments when we come to that. And all three of the people you see have been involved in thinking about democracy and how we can improve it, how can we can reconnect it, how we can change it. And they all are part of the Assemblies for London, and they've been very active in looking at how we can set up a constitutional convention to try and rethink our democracy. Well, I'm not going to say a lot more. I'm going to, first of all, ask each of them to introduce themselves, and then we will go into a PowerPoint presentation for about 20 minutes. After that, you will be able to join in the discussion and ask questions and make comments, and the three panelists will then answer those questions. And just to say to Louise, who's just asked how you go into gallery view, you take your cursor to the top right-hand corner and you see next to the videos, if you're on speaker view at the moment, a little sign which says gallery view or speaker view, and you can choose either of those. So that's the way you do it. So anyhow, don't forget, put your questions up, put your comments up as each of the speakers speaks. Anyhow, Andy, would you like to introduce yourself first and tell us a bit about yourself?
Yes, hi everybody. I'm Andy Paice. I've been a member of Assemblies for Democracy since early on, since about 2014. I'm a facilitator and I'm deeply interested in really how we want of engaged active citizens that actually co-create our society. So I'll hand over to Corinna.
Hi everybody, thanks for being here. I'm Corinna Lotz and I'm one of the co-conveners of Assemblies for Democracy in London, and I've helped to organize a number of events, and I'm also have another hat, which is that I'm an art critic. That's it.
Okay, and Paul?
Yeah, I've been involved in the Assemblies for Democracy project since its start in July 2014. I've written a couple of books about democracy and the state as well. So I've been sort of interested in this question of democracy and transition and constitutions for some time.
So Andy, over to you for your presentation.
So I'll hand it over to Corinna, who's going to talk us through. We're each going to talk roughly 6 minutes. Corinna's going to talk about the history of Assemblies for Democracy, and Paul's going to talk about the why of a constitution, and last of all, I'm going to talk about how we, as citizens of the UK, could create a new constitution. So hand over to Corinna.
Okay, well, I'm just going to run you through a little tiny bit of history of how Assemblies for Democracy came into being, and in particular, how the campaign for a Citizens' Convention on the Constitution actually began. And as Francis just said, there's been a very wide recognition that there is a democratic deficit, and also more recently, a very deep constitutional crisis. And Assemblies for Democracy has increasingly focused on the need for a new written constitution, which should be written by and created by people themselves. So it really began 3 years ago when the idea of a new agreement of the people, which is referencing that picture on the bottom right, which was 1647 discussions about a new agreement of the people, an agreement of the people for that time. And there was a meeting held at Parliament, which John McDonnell booked us a room for. And after that, assemblies began in London, Glasgow, and Manchester, Assemblies for Democracy. Yeah, this is called, I've put a heading, Reimagine Democracy 1, because that was the name of an assembly that we organized in March 2015, attended by over 100 people. And that kind of brought together discussions about the nature of the democratic issues, and also increasingly focusing on the need for a new constitution. And that kind of was not prophetic, but it became more a big issue after the 2015 election, the May 2015 election, where a conservative government was elected by only 24.3% of the electorate, which kind of shocked people a lot. And immediately after the election, Assemblies for Democracy, Occupy Democracy, and Open Democracy held an assembly outside Parliament, which is what you're seeing in the picture there, calling for a citizens' convention on the Constitution. And the person in the blue shirts with his arm on the right-hand side is Anthony Barnett of Open Democracy. Behind him is Paul, that is in this webinar now. And the people on the mat are different people, mostly from Occupy Democracy. So that was quite a dramatic moment, and it continued, the impetus continued through to June, when there was the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta, and there was a festival held at Runnymede, which a number of us attended, and we kind of raised the call for a new Magna Carta. In other words, a new relationship between people and power, and how a new constitution could work to create a different foundation for how we are ruled. That kind of took us to November that year, when 150 people came to the Waterloo Action Centre to listen to quite a lot of speakers, prominent amongst whom was the then leader of the Green Party, who was in the picture. And it was a very, very participatory event with something like 20 working groups that discussed different aspects of democracy. And out of that, a planning group volunteered to take the project for a constitutional convention forward. And we agreed with quite a large number of people, and a large consensus, that the major principle should be that democratic power should rest with the people as a sort of underlying principle. And then to kind of deepen the understanding, and with expertise and democracy campaigners who'd done themselves quite a lot of work, people came together in March last year at Parliament, which is, you see that John McDonnell in the picture, he came into the meeting, and there was a very, very deep discussion with quite a lot of experts on how a convention could be organized and what it should be based on. We then organized this is immediately after the Brexit referendum, we organized a letter. We asked people to sign a letter calling for a new UK citizens' constitution, which you see there, and it was published in The Guardian on the 1st of July. And it was we were very encouraged, because everybody virtually that we asked immediately agreed to sign it with great enthusiasm, including Michael Mansfield, who said, his words were, "It's time to take the high ground" after the Brexit vote. In other words, the constitution should, become a really major issue. And this is my last slide, but I'd like to say that in May of this year, we very much due to our work, the Labour Party manifesto actually included a section where it said it would establish a constitutional convention to examine and advise on reforming the way Britain works at a fundamental level. And I quote, "It will consult on its form in terms of reference and invite recommendations on extending democracy." So we thought that was very important that they included that, even though it was in a very rather obscure place in the manifesto. I think Andy will say a bit more about this later, but our current campaign is, we're working for a meeting this October, and we've started to invite these very signatories that you have seen in front of you, and others who are serious and who want to see a new written constitution to come along to a meeting at Parliament. And the aim of this meeting will be to create an alliance for a citizens' convention.
Part of the Assemblies for Democracy's work has been to establish what a constitution actually is. So this slide tries to sort of begin that work. If we want to change the constitution, we really ought to know what it is. And so we've started an online project to map out the constitution, which is not here, but the elements of the constitution. But in general, as a constitution is, as the UCL Constitution Unit tells us, it's the form, the rules, the regulation and distribution about how state power operates. It's quite important. So it's how the state governs us and how the different parts of the state relate to each other. So changing the constitution implies changing the way the state operates. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. As you know, I'm sure our constitution is a peculiar, typically British beast. It's not in any one place like the US Constitution, but it's a collection of laws, conventions, traditions even, and judicial decisions. And I think this allows for a certain amount of ambiguity, of course, and mystery, which the political class simply love. So, but in all of the documents that are talked about here, there is nowhere stated the actual purpose, the raison d'etre for the state. It's not there. So why does it need replacing? Well, I think we've come up with a series of reasons over the last few years in our discussions why the present democracy is a flawed democracy at best and a phantom democracy at worst. Firstly, it's from another period of history, and this is the Mary and William of Orange announcing that they would become the first constitutional monarchs in this country, the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and then forming the union with Scotland in 1707. So this was a system of government established at the end of the 17th century. It took another 200 years or so to establish the right for men to vote and even longer for women to get the vote. So the Constitution comes from a time when the landed aristocracy was still powerful and industrialization driven by capitalism was to follow. So I think it's past its use-by date. So some other reasons that we have been discussing, that it's a parliamentary democracy in name only, in the sense that the parliament is subordinate to the executive. It doesn't initiate legislation. The executive has inherited rule by royal prerogative, or lots of the royal prerogatives. Much legislation is not actually detailed, but it's then enacted through statutory instruments, which come later and which are not debated in Parliament. And as everybody I'm sure is aware, the first past the post voting system is deeply flawed in the sense it does not reflect the aspirations of different sections in society. Perhaps more significantly than the ones I've just mentioned, the actual problems with the state and the way it works, is that in the last 30 odd years, I suppose, many people come to understand how corporate and financial power dominates politics and dominates policy making. And some people say, like Monbiot, that it's actually captured the state. So the state is seen as partial towards markets and big business, and some may even call it a corporatocracy rather than a democracy. And this was a factor behind the Brexit vote, no doubt, but also the constitution is now being changed as a result of Brexit but without involving the citizens of the UK. Joining the EU was a constitutional change. Leaving the EU is a major constitutional change, but we wouldn't know it. And whatever power is repatriated from Brussels will not go to the people as promised, but it will go to the government and to the state. The powerlessness that people feel was experienced most tragically at Grenfell Tower. So it's symptomatic, I think, of the gross inequality the present state system and constitution has enabled or facilitated. So ultimately, we need a new constitution for all these reasons. And finally, because the state has failed, the constitution has failed in terms of climate change, in providing housing, welfare for its citizens, and protecting its citizens as well from random terror attacks. So I think in whichever way you look at it, there is a case for a new constitution.
So basically, the question is, how is this constitution going to be changed? And within our present system, there are certainly politicians who do see the need for a convention, but there's arguments that there should be a sort of cross-party convention of politicians. But the question we're sort of posing is, if it's done just within Parliament, to what degree is that kind of convention legitimate? We feel that a real constitutional convention must be a sort of voice of we the people, which must include the whole nation, the whole of the UK. So how do you go about doing that? Well, we do have some examples that have taken place recently in different countries. A few years ago in Iceland, there was, just after the 2008 crash, and the government was discredited, and there was a new parliament that came in. Members of civil society made demands and pushed for the fact that they needed a new constitution, and they decided that the best way to do this was to actually crowdsource it. So they did this through having 1,000 people randomly selected, using what's known as sortition, which then sort of put forward the values of what would be the guiding values for a constitution. And then 25 elected citizens then drafted a constitution according to those values that had been put forward. And after 4 months of meeting together and having input from the whole nation via the internet, via a web platform, they did actually crowdsource a new drafted constitution, which went to a referendum, and 67% accepted it. So they created a new constitution. However, this did not get implemented, unfortunately, because of some reactionary forces, some maybe right-wing forces in the government that felt it was the job of the politicians, not the people. So it was a non-binding referendum, and unfortunately didn't get through. Also, we've seen in Ireland recently, from 2012 to 2014, there's been a whole constitutional convention. This is a different one. It's not an independent one where citizens have got together. It's more of a mixed model with politicians and citizens coming together. It's, I think, 2/3 randomly selected citizens and 1/3 politicians. The advantages of it were the politicians were involved, so there was some buy-in and from politicians, and they really argued for the proposals that are coming out of that convention. The disadvantages were that it was only working on minor constitutional change. It didn't have real power somehow, and it was really like just an advisory assembly rather than having a real power to change things. So it did actually come up with some great results. It came up with the referendum for same-sex marriage, which got passed in Ireland a few years ago. So it did come up with some real results. Yeah, what we are saying basically is that we feel that for the UK, it's important to have an independent, citizen-led conventional constitution, one that would eventually create some kind of a document that would have the legitimacy of being created by the people, that then maybe not necessarily would be immediately accepted by Parliament, but would evoke some sort of pressure on the political system, given that this had been a whole process. If the process is done correctly and with the proper transparency, then it has a real sort of legitimacy. So one possible model for this, I think time's running on, I won't speak too long about this, but there's in Holland and Belgium, there's something called the G1000 that has been working on bringing together a large number of randomly selected citizens. And the idea of random selection, by the way, is that it brings in a real diversity of the society. And contrary to maybe what the political classes believe, actually, ordinary citizens have been known to produce great results when they come together and they have some advice from experts who are on tap, not on top, who are coming in and as advising the deliberation of the citizens. They actually can come up with great proposals, and this has happened time and again in experiments around the world. So yeah, there's a proposal in Holland now for a citizen-led constitutional convention, which has a whole process. I can't go through it now. I've got a whole sort of list of things here, but basically it starts off with a meeting of 1,000 people. Then the proposals that come out of that are worked on by working groups over a period of 6 to 9 months. And the citizens come in and they're given some money to participate, a little stipend to participate 1 weekend per month. And they are advised, once again, like in Iceland, by online comments from the whole population, and also expert panels and politicians and business people. And that helps the citizens to refine their proposals, which actually end up as a document, a drafted document for a constitution. So this is a very rough outline of what could happen in the UK, something like this. And for Assemblies democracy, basically what we're doing is putting together, we're trying to create an alliance that's going to come together in October for a first meeting of civil society groups. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Democracy campaigns and academics to come together and work out basically what's the best way forward. How can we move forward? Because there are some people who have more of an idea of a parliamentary route, like the Irish example. Assemblies for Democracy, we have more of a sort of an independent citizen-led route, but we want to work out together what's the best way. So we are bringing people from all different persuasions and ideas together to work on this question of how to actually create a citizen-led constitution.
Anyhow, I mean, thanks for that, all of you. That was really interesting. And you told us about how the movements got together. You told us about what's wrong with the present system. And Andy, you've given us some ideas how we might go forward. I mean, what, in your opinion, is the best way, do you think, to go forward for the United Kingdom? I mean, Iceland is a small country. Britain is a medium-sized country. It has 60 million, 65 million people in it, in the United Kingdom. And it's divided into different regions and different nations as well. How do you tackle that problem? What's your view about the best way forward to get a convention going?
I think, from my point of view, in Assemblies for Democracy, we're a broad church of different ideas. So this is, I'm giving my personal opinion, is that we need to actually get the process going, that itself actually exerts a pressure. So, yeah, if we can create at least a legitimate process, like I described, some of the things that have happened, for example, in Holland or in Iceland, if we can get a similar process going where we have an alliance that backs it and we can have sufficient funding to set up a convention which has input from the whole nation, because it creates a precedent and it's a sort of a voice of we the people. So I think it's a good first step. And if that gets publicity, it gets shared on social media and hopefully, in the newspapers, it starts to create a stir and affects the political mainstream.
Okay. I mean, does anyone else want to come in on that? Or maybe if you'd like Fong to take up the question that came in from Robbie Griffiths, because that really relates to what Andy's just said.
So Robbie said that he agreed with the needs for a new constitution, but he doesn't see the engagement enthusiastic from the people in the UK, like they had for Iceland, Finland. So what are the conditions for creating a citizen-led constitution, and how do we get there?
Okay, who'd like to come on that? I mean, basically saying in this country there isn't a great amount of enthusiasm for it.
I think one of the problems is that we don't have this explicit constitution, so it's very hard to argue about something which most people don't really see or don't even know we have. But I think one of our issues is raising I think what we have succeeded in doing is raising the fact that we do have a constitution and there is a crisis of the constitution. We put that on the agenda in a number of ways with a number of parts. I think it was important that it was in the Labour Party manifesto. Very important. And the Green Party, I know, also supports this idea of a convention. I would say that we've got to articulate what has been expressed in terms of the Brexit vote, which we all know was very contradictory. But if you like, you could argue that was also a demand for a new kind of constitutional settlement. It's up, I think, to us to relate our campaign for a constitution to some very basic issues that people face in terms of housing, health, jobs, pay, and all the rest of it. I think we have to make it more concrete and relate it more to people's interests and concerns. Then I think we could get something going that way. Thank you.
Okay, did anyone else want to add to that? No. Okay, well, Monica, hold on a sec, we need to unmute you.
Well, the point is that we have a great opportunity coming up right now as a result of Brexit, which is that it's going to become obvious to everybody that we've had rights for 40 years that are constitutional rights. In other words, they can't be changed except by these mega majorities, or mainly about 60% or 55% of the people. So super majorities, they're called in the States. So we've had all these thousands of rights, and that's not just we, is everybody in one way or another, everybody affected by anti-discrimination and law and rights at work and so on. And these are going to be downgraded by the British Parliament to simple, ordinary acts of Parliament, which can be thrown out by one MP. That's all you need, one person majorities instead of 60% of the Assembly. And this is going to be debated in the with the Great Repeal Bill, where this is going to come up. So I want to say that one of the great advantages of the EU, but also of proper constitutions, is that it gives people solid rights, entrenched, not never to be changed, but to be changed only by a huge consensus. And that's something we never had in Britain. So I think it should be part of the debate that has begun on constitution ever since the anniversary of the Magna Charta, but in particular that is coming up this September, and that we should be aware that we are now being downgraded in hundreds of ways.
Okay, well, let's take that question up, because I want to get other people in as well and other people's points. Do you want to respond to that? I mean, maybe Paul, because you were the one who were arguing about the importance of a written constitution. Monica raises that point that, we don't have a constitution, and that allows prerogative powers to be used willy-nilly. And a constitution is basically the best guard of our freedom.
Constitutions are only as good as the way they're honoured in practice. I mean, if you talk about Spain or even the United States, where they have written constitutions, it's a very flawed democracy, and in Spain a particularly corrupt democracy, some might argue, and the United States almost developing into a kind of business-like coup against the constitution. So I think I don't think a constitution in and of itself is a guarantor. I think we need a different kind of constitution, one that's actually founded on this question of the sovereignty of the people. I don't think any existing constitutions, Spain or United States, do that. And so I think we need a 21st century approach to democratic rights and democracy. Quite a different animal to the existing constitutional approach.
Let me ask you, as we go along, I mean, you talk about developing a convention. I mean, you haven't, I mean, is your aim just to get a convention and you don't care what comes out of it? I mean, they may come out with a very authoritarian constitution. You know, if you have a lot of populists come onto your convention, you could get the result you don't want. I mean, have you given any thought about that? I mean, do you have an end game that you're playing towards? Or, you know, what's the output that you would like to see?
I think I can speak to that. It's true. There is a danger. You don't know what a randomly selected group of people are going to come up with. However, what seems to be pretty consistent is that when people come together, they have time to deliberate. It, first of all, is a transformative experience. So quite often, the ideas and opinions that they walk into the room, if they're, you know, if you think, oh, well, it's going to be a bunch of Sun readers getting together and coming up with something that is going to be representative of what you read in the Sun, I think that's not how deliberation takes place. I think what happens in these spaces is an entirely different, just an entirely different order, really. And it's been seen that pretty generally, when the group of people is well informed and that they have access to experts who can advise them on certain aspects of what they're working on, that they often come up with proposals that are a lot more radical than what parliaments would come up with, in fact. So my personal conviction is that if you get a diverse bunch of people together, which is the idea of random selection and using stratified sampling so that you get you know, an equal sort of distribution of gender, of people from, let's say, different regions, of people from different economic backgrounds, and you have good facilitation, that actually they come up with proposals that are representative, that are much more representative of the people rather than vested interests, which is what we have now. So, yeah, that would be my answer for that.
Okay, Fong, do you want to take up Peter's point?
Yes, Peter, he said that he agreed with Monica about the consensus decision versus more individual ones. But however, the combine between the two with the other changes would be needed.
Yeah, I think on the question of what if it came up with, that you raised, Francis, what if it comes up with bad, what quote unquote bad results? Well, I think our starting point is that when people do come together to solve a problem, like how we should be ruled and where power should lie, these are the problems that a constitutional convention would have to address. That people, it's in human nature to solve problems like that. That's what human beings have done historically. So we have a confidence in them. And as Andy said, experience has actually shown in where it has been tried that it's been very, very, very positive results. The problem has been not being able to implement them, actually, for example, in Iceland. So I think that confidence is a good starting point. And also, but going back to the question of, you know, how can there be conditions for doing this, better conditions? Well, that once the process is started, it will gather, it must, well, if it's done in a careful, thoughtful way, it can gather has potential for having a huge momentum. The problem is that when people face life and death questions like Grenfell Tower, like the NHS, like whether they're going to have a job or not, whether they can feed their children, whether they can afford a mortgage, these things people don't, it's the art and the science of relating this to Constitution. That's the challenge, which has, it's a big, big challenge, and it needs a lot of people to work on it and find answers to that. But if that can be addressed, then it can become it needs to be a mass popular social movement for a constitution. I think that's the challenge that we're trying to address.
What Tim is saying, the same as you, in the first part of what he writes here, and that's he's saying that it has to be mass and a momentum may develop, but he also says that it will help if you have an outlined strategy first, so that people can see where you're going, and secondly, he says that the idea of a constitution is to protect the citizens from abuse of power. And consequently, it would be wrong to invoke parliamentarians. He's assuming that parliamentarians are part of the state and not a part of the people, which is a debatable question, but it's an interesting one. So, I mean, how do you feel about having a strategy and involving parliamentarians in a convention, which is a sort of Irish model, I think you mentioned, Andy?
I mean, it is a contradictory thing because, as you say, Parliament is part of the state, but it has its long history, the struggle for democracy as well. And so I don't think it's not about excluding Parliament. I think it's about how the process is completed is another question. Can it be completed by Parliament? What would happen if Parliament rejected the work of the convention? It would produce a constitutional crisis, I suppose. But to go back to the idea of to set the ball rolling, I think you can't prejudge what a convention should discuss or what it should come up with, but you could give it a framework to say that we would like to come up with a constitutional settlement which is based on the sovereignty of the people as a democratic principle and deals with the questions or addresses the questions of corporate power, for example. One or two questions that ought to be addressed. I think then, rather than just saying, let's just sit down and talk about the Constitution, what's the purpose of it? And the letter that was signed to the Guardian, the idea was that it would address this question of where power lies and where it should lie, which in fact is also referred to in the Labour Party manifesto. So I think that would be a way, just this phone from going, I think that would be a way to kickstart the process, but not to prejudge what it comes up with.
Okay, I mean, we've got a question in on the Q&A from Gavin Barker, and he's basically saying maybe we should do this in a two-stage process. One is, for example, forging a set of governing principles which guides the legislative work of Parliament, and which Parliament must abide by or face a legal challenge if they don't do that. And then stage two is to have a fully fledged convention which develops a wider constitution, which looks at what we should replace our present system by. So he's arguing for a step-by-step approach. Would any of you like to respond to that?
I think the idea of having an initial framework setting, the convention works on the framework. I think that's very important. I think that's a good first step. And then to move on to more concrete deliberations within that framework, and then to present some constitutional changes or a constitutional settlement, and then to put that before the Parliament and to see how that goes, but not to give up on that point if it's not accepted. For then the convention to become, the new power would be a fantastic ambition, I'd say. But there are historical precedents for this in England a long time ago. So I think your stages approach is a good one. First one, to set the framework. I think it's very important that we get the framework sorted.
Yeah, I mean, just the whole thing is a tricky thing. Even the first step is not easy. Perhaps I don't know, perhaps with a more radical government, perhaps who knows if Jeremy Corbyn were to become the next prime minister, that may become a sort of thing that we could start to have those governing principles that would set up a framework for it. But it's not immediately apparent. I mean, I think one big problem in this whole question is the fact of the whole question of representation, given that members of parliament see themselves as representatives of the people, and that they sort of hold that role very dear, to then set up a whole process where their power is then taken away and that the power really rests in the people is not an easy one. So yeah, I think this is a thing that's going to take some time. It's going to take some brokering. It's going to take a lot of but I think it does need a strong sort of movement from the grassroots, and a push and a sort of a movement that really is almost like a demand for change. So I think that's partly what we're about as well.
Okay, Fong, over to you.
Yes, I think that there are two questions here. Was from Perry. He was talking about the countries who changed or created new constitution. They had a moment. But do we have that kind of crisis to create or to change constitution? However, Terry also mentioned that England is a monarchy, so we may have our inherit a monarchy constitution. So it is not as what we are talking about here for general Europe.
The question of who is, who is the people, and how do you avoid creating an elite, which is connected, because we now have, in this period of history, we have, as you've just said, Fong, it is a constitutional crisis. It's a constitutional moment in that sense, because of all these crises that have come together. And also, that we have the conditions for the first time in history that you can involve very large numbers of people through various forms of technology that were never there before, and it makes it possible to do that on even much bigger scale in Iceland for a big country like Britain. I mean, there are possibilities out there with technology that would enable a massive consultation process, a genuine consultation process, to take place. I mean, I haven't got a formula for that, but it's potential. The potential is there for the first time, I would say, and also related to that, the potential for avoiding bureaucratization and elitism is also building in safeguards and having rotation and having people subject to recall. All these ways of avoiding ossification of the process can be built in, and that there's an awareness that they need to be avoided, I think, more now than ever before as well. So I think it can be quite positive that there are answers to these questions out there and being developed as we speak. Anyway, thanks.
Okay, so in a way, I mean, you've answered Heather's point, and I think Callum's point as well. Monica asks, following up for what she said earlier, do you agree that we need, as a first step, for the House of Commons to agree that some acts of Parliament should entrench rights, meaning that they will not be removed or watered down except by a majority of 55 or 60% of those voting? Well, no, that's basically what she said. I'm not sure she means 55 or 60% of Parliament voting. There should be a big majority, or whether that would involve direct democracy at all. So, I mean, she's saying, right, there has to be some safeguards. A simple majority is not enough.
That's more, yes, to do with direct democracy and referendums. For example, Brexit, yes, we had 52% voting for Brexit. And yeah, that's more of a question around voting. I guess what we're talking about here is more, the answer is that on questions like that of how Parliament should, and what sort of a majority is necessary for a referendum, I would say in general, yes, a supermajority is probably a more certain way of passing referendums. But I guess what we're arguing for here is even outside of the realm of referendum. It's deliberation. It's citizen deliberation plus referendum, if you like. So it's one of the aspects of citizen deliberation is that you are working perhaps with microcosms of society. So a convention could be a microcosm of the United Kingdom, and then that puts forward proposals which then get voted on by a referendum, for example, by the larger population. I don't know if that totally answers the question, but it's what comes up for me.
I mean, some people would argue, and lots of populists would argue, I've heard them argue it, you don't need a convention, you don't need deliberation, direct democracy will do it all. With the growth of the internet and with the growth of big data, you can find out more about what people want than you ever could by even sortition. And so all you need to use is a new technology. How do you relate to that? Isn't that an alternative to a convention?
I don't think it addresses such a process. Doesn't address the fundamental issue of, the power to make decisions in society, which I think was shown vividly over the Grenfell Tower tragedy. Where are decisions made? How can people not just influence decisions, but be part of the decision-making process? And how things like corporate power, how are these things to be addressed? Not just about finding out what people want, but actually about redistributing power and state and power in a modern 21st century way. I think this can only be addressed by a constitution, in my view. Otherwise, it's a sort of rearranging deck chairs job. And I think and just finally on the questions of whether the time is right, I think Brexit is a bigger constitutional crisis than anybody has been talking about here. And in the next year or so, the things it will blow. I think it will blow over Brexit. And the crisis of the constitution will be brought into very sharp relief. So I think we'll have our opportunity to do what we're talking about this evening.
Okay, anybody else want to respond to that? Or you're happy? Okay. We did have one earlier question from someone who's come on as an anonymous attendee. He may have come on by phone, that's why. I mean, you're talking about citizens, but he's saying, or she's saying, would you include in your consultation small and medium-sized and large businesses as part of the constitution engagement? Is it one person, one vote, or do other people have a different stake in the convention because of the contribution they make to the economy?
Maybe I can answer that. I mean, the G1000 model I talked about, the idea of that is actually to bring the whole system within the room. So when we say the whole system, yeah, I mean, not just citizens, not just communities, but also civil society, and that also means businesses as well. I think in order to, all sort of perspectives have to be taken on board, because anybody that gets locked out of this process to some degree is going to want to fight back and disrupt it. So my personal feeling is that we can only create sort of collectively wise outcomes when we involve all of the different perspectives, and that would include businesses. Now, right now, corporate power is sort of trumps everything, but if they are brought into a process in which they're just one voice amongst many, then it's aggregated a lot more with how the decisions get made. So but I would definitely say it's important to include the voice of business as well, for sure.
Fong, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I would like to ask Andy, so what is happening today? How do you involve big businesses?
Well, at the level we're at right now, we are just in the level of creating very much the sort of foundations for constitutional convention by trying to get an alliance together. And it's more in the process of designing and trying to find some sort of agreement about a way forward. So right now we don't involve business. No, we're just a group of people who, but if there is anybody who is involved in business who's interested in this, then by all means come on board and help us design.
Okay. Paul Gavin Barker asked an interesting question, which is one that, we see in Venezuela, and it's a fact where they have a convention to oppose Parliament, and it raises really, really serious questions that could lead, excuse me, to a civil war situation. And Paul asks, what if Parliament rejects the convention or the recommendation of the convention? Where do we go from there?
It's a difficult one because we're into the unknown at that point. I mean, as you know, in our history, we had the English Civil War, which is about Parliament versus the monarchy. And then at the Glorious Revolution, they couldn't convene the Parliament because the king had fled. So they had a convention Parliament, which was sort of illegitimate, but ratified the constitutional monarchy. And then Parliament met and ratified what the convention Parliament had already decided. So in a sense, you're faced with, I suppose, people developing a kind of a convention Parliament, and that and to see if that pressure can be applied that way. If the present Parliament won't do it, perhaps a convention Parliament might do it. But then we have to think of some devices. I can see in Venezuela it was down the road. It's going down the road of a civil war. I think that's correct. We had our civil war in the 17th century, and obviously we must try and avoid another one. So I think we have to come up with some devices, a popular referendum, or somehow maybe assemblies forming all over the country and people beginning to create a sort of a civil power. I don't know. I think these things we're not at that stage, but it'd be wrong not to think about what happens when we get to that point.
Okay, well, we're getting close to the end of the hour, and we've got a couple other questions. One about direct democracy and not involving corporations because they control that direct democracy, and that's an interesting point from Tim because it's an important point. But let's end on you perhaps explaining. You talk about a constitutional convention, and you're also from the Assembly movement. You're in the London Assembly, all of you. That suggests that you do have some idea about assemblies having a bigger role in whatever the constitutional outcome of the convention is. Am I correct in saying that, Andy? And would you like to end by telling us, what you mean by assembly and how you see their place in the new constitutional arrangement?
It's a good question. Yeah, I think it's something that is sort of emerging for us as well. What is an assembly? There are different approaches to what assembly could be. It could be simply saying at a certain time people can come along and anybody who wants to attend can come along. The drawbacks of that kind of assembly is that you'll get usual suspects, people who are sort of interested in social issues and activism will come along. Or it could be by invitation, or it could be an assembly of different civil society groups that come together, or it could be using sortition, which brings in randomly selected citizens, or it could be a sort of synthesis of all of those together. So we don't have at the moment sort of one standard model of what an assembly should look like. I mean, I personally feel that when it comes to a constitutional convention, that at least one large assembly representing the whole of the UK should be set up, and I think random selection is the best model we would have to include the diversity of the people of the UK. But it's by no means one that we have a hard and fast definitive answer for yet. We're doing work on this, and it's a work in progress. Okay, well, thanks for that. I mean, that's been an interesting webinar, and it clearly raises a lot of more questions that needs to be asked, so to be answered. And I guess this is work in process, so a lot of things will happen. So thank you all for taking part in this, and
for the contributions you made. And thank you all for the questions that you've put as well. This will be recorded. I will edit it down, try and edit out some of the glitches that be recorded, and I hope I'll get it to you tomorrow. Can't guarantee that, but I'll do my best to get it round to everyone. So thank you all for attending. It's been a great webinar.